In this lesson, we're going to take a look at modes. So by now, you should have we've already talked about the major scale, and we built the major scale. And so if you need to review, you could go back to the C major scale, which we did in the previous lesson. So modes are like scales, and in fact, the C major scale is actually a mode. We're not going to worry about that for right now, but the C major scale, which we're going to use as the basis for when we're talking about modes a little bit. And again, we did this in an earlier lesson. It's using the pattern of whole steps and half steps, G, A, B, and C, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So modes, which were a basis for music in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, it's kind of an earlier way of a type of a sound that the music had. And the music sounded normal to them back then, where today a lot of our music is based on the major scale, and that sounds more typical to us, although we are seeing some modal influences, especially in world music. So when we are working on modes, if we start on a different note, but we maintain the same pattern of whole steps and half steps, but we start and end on a different note, it's going to give us a different sound. So if we start and end on D, so we have a D there, we're going to add a D up here. It's going to sound different than our major scale. So for just a review, this is what the C major scale sounded like. If we start on D and we end on D, and we play all the same notes that we had in the C major scale, so we're not going to make a D major scale. In other words, we're not going to start on D and make whole steps and half steps in this pattern. We're going to start here. So it's going to be whole, half, whole, 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 half, and then we're going to go over here and get a whole. And that's going to be our pattern of whole steps and half steps. It's going to sound like this. It probably sounds a little different to our ears. So that's going to be, that's called Dorian. D-O-R-I-A-N. So if we go, instead of Dorian, if we decide that we're going to instead start here on the E, and we're going to play up to the E up here, that is going to be called Phrygian. That pattern of whole steps and half steps. Again, we're not changing what's down here. That pattern is going to stay the same. And that's because we're talking about modes now. We're not talking about scales. We're talking about modes. So that's going to sound like this. A little different. And again, it's different to our ears, most likely. It's probably not the basis for a lot of the music that you might listen to. If we start and end on F, that's going to be called Lydian. Again, just a little bit different of a sound. Start and end on G, that's going to be called Mixolydian. And that will sound like this. And if we start and end on A, that's going to be called Aeolian, which is also the same as our natural minor. So when we talked about scales in the previous lesson, we talked about the major scale, and we also have minor scales. And the natural minor scale, so this is a little more familiar probably to most people's ears who would be listening to this. But again, you know, it does sound a little bit different because a lot of times we use other forms of the minor scale. So for the purposes of this video, this is really just about a very, very basic introduction to the sound of modes. This is not geared toward a music major. This is geared toward someone just doing a little exploration in a Music 101 class to have a chance to learn a little bit about the sound of the modes. So the most important thing to take out of this is how modes sound different from scales. Even though the whole steps and half steps are occurring in the same order, the starting and ending pitches are different. And so that gives an overall kind of landing point sound that is different than the major scale or the minor scale that a lot of music is based on. So I hope that helped you understand that a little bit more.